If the agency were to come to us and say, okay, we're going to eliminate your positions, you would have the opportunity to move to another position within the FDA. But effectively, what the agency decided to do, and this is coming from HHS at this point, HHS decided to eliminate entire divisions, thereby preempting the bump and retreat process. But it's important to note, too, that it wasn't just the policy division in OPDP. There were multiple policy divisions throughout the FDA that were eliminated. It seemed as if they selected policy divisions for targeting. And then the RIFs also severely impacted support services, things like HR, IT, the offices that handle contracting and program management.
Hi, everyone. I'm Virginia Foley, and I'm joined by Jason Cober. As you most likely recall, in April 2025, there was a massive layoff that affected many government agencies across the United States, which was referred to as a reduction in force, or we commonly call it the RIF. Today, we'll be focusing on the RIFs at FDA's Office of Prescription Drug Promotion. Why does this matter? It's pretty simple. Organizational structure and stability in government agencies impacts regulatory policy in complex ways. Volatility at the agencies that regulate pharma or prescription drugs creates uncertainty, instability, and a lack of predictability in regulatory decision-making. At Compliance Forward, our goal is to provide regulatory decision makers with the clarity they need to move forward with confidence. We can't separate the FDA's aggressive enforcement disposition from the staffing changes the agency has experienced over the last 18 months. One directly impacts the other in meaningful ways. Understanding the agency's policy position and where it is heading directionally is complex, and one of the most important inputs in that analysis is understanding how staffing changes at the agency influence decision-making. To that end, having an insider's perspective on not only the April 2025 RIF, but the broader efforts by the current administration to reduce headcount at the FDA is critical to understanding which policy and enforcement objectives the agency can achieve and which ones are aspirational. In today's podcast, we will look at a first-hand account from the April 2025 reduction in force, how it impacted FDA's Office of Prescription Drug Promotion, and what are some misconceptions that we should be aware of from a regulatory strategy perspective. So let's get into it. Hi, Jason.
Hey, Virginia.
Hi, thanks for doing this. This is really important work. So I think a good way to start would be talking about what is a RIF, and is there any historical reference to when and where RIFs were conducted in government before April 2025?
Yeah, it's a really great question. You and I have talked a lot about my background. I studied political science in college. I have a master's in public administration. And as I was earning my graduate degree, one of the things that we looked at very closely was the efforts through the Clinton administration to reduce headcount in the executive branch of the government. So the idea of a RIF is specific to government. It's actually a procedure that the government has codified into law for how it intends to reduce headcount. There was a lot of this done in 1995 and throughout really the period of the Clinton administration. I don't think casual observers of the government really recognize how much the Clinton administration tried to pare down the size of the federal workforce. But to give you an example of how a RIF typically works, I think one of the more prominent case studies is from the Norfolk shipyard. And in the mid-90s, basically the way that this worked was Congress decided the United States Navy didn't need to build as many ships as they were. So what they decided to do was basically reduce the size of the Norfolk shipbuilding operation, basically cut it in half. What they did was they conducted a reduction in force. And the way that this works is, you assume that you have a certain amount of duplication of effort across these two shipbuilding operations, but you don't want to lose experienced staff, and you want to retain experienced staff. You want to retain specialized staff. A reduction in force is intended to do these kind of layoffs in a very targeted manner. Typically, government will try to first reduce headcount through attrition. We're going to stop hiring We're not going to fill certain positions. We're just going to get rid of these open vacant positions. That's the first step. But then what happens with a reduction of force is you create what we call a register in the government. And everyone has a number associated with them. That number is based on one, are you a veteran? Two, what is your total time of service, including both your time in federal service and if you served in the military? And then also looking at your recent performance ratings, specifically your last 3 years of performance. And this generates a number. So everybody has a number, and whether you're subject to the reduction in force or not, your number matters. Because if you are subject to the reduction in force, in this case, when we're talking about the Norfolk shipyard example, the folks in the shipyard that was being shuttered, they could look at the other shipyard and say, okay, I have a higher number than somebody who's over there. I can do what's called bump and retreat. I can bump that person who has a lower number so they have less time, a lower performance rating, maybe less time from military experience. They can bump somebody from the other shipyard off of their position. And this is how a reorganization typically works. There's an organized structure, and it ensures that the government is retaining the most experienced people, the top performers, and those individuals with the most expertise.
That makes sense. And I appreciate the explanation because I had never heard of it until April 2025. So why was the RIF in 2025 conducted then?
At this point, we don't know. So the government has not been forthcoming with the reasons, specifically how they selected the offices that were going to be subject to the reductions in force, or how they basically put those lists together. There's a number of ongoing lawsuits that are planned to go through the discovery process, and the hope is that at some point, the employees who were subject to the reductions in force will find out how they were selected and what the motivating factor was. But at this point, we just don't know how the agency selected the offices that were subject to the RIFs.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. So what about OPDP, where you work, the Office of Prescription Drug Promotion? Who was RIFed from that office?
Yeah, specifically in OPDP, the entire policy division was eliminated. So as I said, in a standard RIF, the way a reduction of force is supposed to happen is your retention schedule, your retention number matters across the entire organization. As we were leading into the reduction in force last year in 2025, the thinking was that the agency would try to circumvent that process by eliminating entire divisions and effectively saying there is no bump and retreat option because we're going to eliminate your entire organizational unit. That's a new and novel definition of what the organizational unit is. Typically, if we're talking about a RIF targeted at, say, the FDA, you would expect that bump and retreat rights would be conveyed to the entire agency. So if the agency were to come to us and say, okay, we're going to eliminate your positions, you would have the opportunity to move to another position within the FDA. But effectively, what the agency decided to do, and this is coming from HHS at this point, HHS decided to eliminate entire divisions, thereby preempting the bump and retreat process. But it's important to note, too, that it wasn't just the policy division in OPDP. There were multiple policy divisions throughout the FDA that were eliminated. It seemed as if they selected policy divisions for targeting. And then the RIFs also severely impacted support services, things like HR, IT, the offices that handle contracting and program management.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot. So can you share what an FDA policy office is and what did they do?
Yeah, I think that this is one of the things that I've encountered over the last year is I don't know that it's really well understood what a policy division does, because when you look at the organizational chart for, say, the FDA, it has a number of policy offices. There's the Office of Regulatory Policy, the Office of Medical Policy, Office of New Drug Policy, Office of Generic Drug Policy. It seems like these policy divisions are kind of spread all out throughout the FDA. But a policy division is very specific to the office that it supports, that it's aligned with. And the policy divisions are really comprised of highly experienced regulatory and operational staff. When you look at the career progression through a regulatory agency, say like the FDA, the career projection for some people is going to be moving into management and advancing through your career through levels of management. But another track is to go through policy. So you typically get experience doing, say, review work in O&D or review work in OPDP. But after you typically have, 4, 5, 6 years experience, then you can advance to a policy group where you get to set policy for the organizational group that you are working with. So in this case, the OPDP policy shop was comprised of some very experienced review staff, but not just that, staff who had been working with OPDP since back when it was DDMAC. So a policy division is typically responsible for drafting guidances and regulations, but also the operational units are responsible for shepherding these regulatory documents through the Byzantine maze of clearances that you have to go through in the agency. So they're very savvy operators as far as how do you get things done within the sprawling bureaucracy of the government. They also help ensure consistency across review divisions, and they help identify and track emerging issues in the ad promo space. And like I said, these policy shops are usually comprised of very experienced staff. I think most of the staff in OPDP's policy division had at least 10 plus years of experience, but many of the staff had close to 20 years, if not more than 20 years experience. So it was a very highly experienced staff.
Okay, thank you. That is very clear. So we're going to take a little break, and we are going to talk next about some specifics of how this all went down. So thank you, and stick with us.